Welcome back. So I'm going to continue our conversation. This is part one big lecture that I'm chopping up into, I think, three or four different lectures regarding second wave feminism. So I start with the 40s and 50s, now I'm moving to 60s. So we're going to look at middle class feminism, particularly white Anglo middle class feminism, and then address women of color, both African American and Mexican American, Chicana women of color, because like I said, that's my forte. And they look at feminism differently from Anglo-American women. So we're going to distinguish them. Sometimes people today think all feminism is equal or it's just the same idea, and it's not. In particular, you read a piece that addresses feminism from a different lens, which is Valerie Solanas' Scum Manifesto. So you'll have a discussion on that piece. So let's look at white feminism. And I'm going to go through this, again, like most lectures, fairly quickly. Now, white feminism originates in the 1960s, particularly in the latter part of the 1960s, and it's with people like Betty Friedan. She's the one of the presidents of the organization called National Organization for Women. She basically, her along with other women, kind of started this movement to address the inequality that women are facing. Yes, they got the vote in the 1920s, but there's still a fair amount of inequality and definitely different factors to consider in the 1960s. So some of the things that they address focus more on their experiences as Anglo-American women and as professional women, whereas the other groups I'll talk about are more kind of lower class or working class. These women, we call them feminists, were mostly middle class. Many of them went to college. Betty Friedan, the problem has no name, the article that you read for the last lesson. Her story is quite interesting because she started off in the 1930s very kind of radical and joining organizations, though in the feminine mystique, she presents herself as some kind of housewife, right? That she's just kind of bored. And, you read the essay that she wanted more in her life. Well, understandably so, because in the 30s she was very politically active. In the 50s she became a housewife taking care of kids. So you can understand how that would have been a major shift for anybody, though that's not really addressed in her book. But when you look at her history, it's quite noticeable that she was very politically active. And maybe that's part of the reason, not the only reason, but something that got her involved in these kind of issues that women were going through. So, as Betty Friedan, again, kind of showcases that feminism in the 1960s derives from what's called the Old Left. I know I didn't lecture about the Old Left because that's really the 1930s, but you have a lot of women who are part of unions, who are protesting out in the streets, who are striking, and then in the 1950s are told, go home, right? Stop all this and be a housewife and focus on taking care of your family. And again, they didn't want to do that. They wanted more out of life. I think even Betty Friedan ended up divorcing her husband, and she wanted to be independent. So, but white feminist is kind of connected to the Old Left. So nothing comes out of a vacuum. Many of these feminists were also kind of young college students. Many of them, if you go to college in the 1950s and 60s, it means that you have money to afford college. So many of them came from the middle class. And again, this is something that would distinguish them from working class feminists. What were some of their goals? Well, number one, they wanted equality. They saw that many of the women who joined different organizations at this time were seen as kind of sex objects. They were part of this kind of free love movement, but a lot of times they were just being objectified in different ways, whether it's within these organizations that were asking for social change, such as SDS, or even just in general American culture where, you have beauty pageants and things like that objectify women. So these were some of the issues that they focus on. Other things that they addressed were that they wanted women in positions of power, both within organizations that they were involved in, but also in the economic sector, the private sector. They wanted women to have more of a voice. They wanted reproductive rights, the right to control their body. Throughout history, abortion has probably become a bigger issue today than in the past, but in the 1950s, it was illegal to get an abortion. Women needed to go into what were called back alley abortion clinics, and there was no sanitation, and some women died from getting abortions. So they wanted to have this ability to make a choice, at the very least, not to force people to have abortions, but they felt like it's their bodies, so they should be able to have a voice in what happens to them. And another kind of major thing that they fought for was an Equal Rights Amendment. They wanted an amendment to the American Constitution to explicitly state that both sexes will be treated as equal. This is something that they pushed for, that they wanted to be ratified by different states. Unfortunately, they didn't get the amount of votes that they needed. I think they needed 38 states and only like 36 or 35 ratified them. And it essentially killed this amendment push. But nevertheless, these women were pushing for this idea that both sexes are equal. We're going to stop it there, and the next lecture will be on African American women.